Andrew Little.
Mr Chairman, I understand why the Honourable Jerry Brownlee is so dismissive of averages, because that was a below-average performance, the likes of which we haven't seen for a long, long time, from what has otherwise been, a scintillating political career. Mr Chairman, I wanted to respond to some of the assertions by the Minister and the Chair, who, in typical National Party style, has heralded the great bounteous virtues of their excessive building program, claiming to have stated facts, but there wasn't a fact amongst them. The reality is, Mr Chairman, that when you look at the house build program at the moment, it is below the houses consented in 2004. So last year, 9,651 houses consented, compared to over 12,000 in 2004. So much for the biggest building program ever in the history of New Zealand. But here's the telling figure. Here's the telling figure. That if you have a look at the build rate per 1,000 people in New Zealand, because let's face it, when you've got a bigger population, of course you should be building more houses. You've got more people, and we've got a rapidly growing population. You've got to build even more. But if you have a look at the number per 1,000 people, sure, it's 6.3 in the past year, compared to 13.1 in 1974. Now, the Minister dismisses those figures and says, oh, but look at interest rates in 1974. Well, actually, a lot of those people were building them under the State Advances Corporation rate of 3%. Right. And then he says inflation was much higher. But hold on, we've got record low inflation right now, at least CPI, as measured by the CPI. We've got record low interest rates, and people still cannot afford to buy their first home. That's the truth about New Zealand today. Unaffordability of housing has never been worse, or greater, or better, however you look at it. Here's the thing, a lot of people can't buy their own home. That's what's happening in New Zealand today. And if you're living in Auckland, and Jerry Brownlee might be dismissive of the $1 million home, he sort of says, well, just because on this day somebody pays $7 million for a house doesn't mean to say that the house down the road is worth as much. I don't know whether he understands things about property markets, because that doesn't make sense. What is happening right now is in Auckland and in other cities around New Zealand, thousands and thousands of New Zealanders, people who live here, some of whom have been born here, others who have come here to live, cannot afford to buy their own home because the prices are out of reach. And the banks are clamping down on lending. They are working harder, the people trying to get the houses, working harder and saving harder, and they still cannot afford to buy their own home. Now, if they're lucky to have rich parents who can back them and bail them out, they might get their home. But even then, and you hear the stories of young couples with mortgages of $800,000, $900,000, $1 million, and they're in their 30s, and they're on salaries of $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, they have a pretty tough time. They are terrified that one of them might lose their jobs. They are terrified that something might change their circumstances and they're out on the street. That's the reality for far too many people today. And then there are those in other parts of Auckland City and other parts of the country who want much more modest housing and who simply cannot get it, or whose incomes are so low they're dependent on renting, and the rents have gone sky high and they can't even afford to rent. That's why Part 3, Mr Chairman, that's why Part 3 of this bill is so vital. It is part of the endless supply of ideas that the Labor Party has to come up with an answer to the housing crisis. Now, the Minister scoffs at the call to have emergency powers or to declare a state of emergency on housing. It is a crisis. We are in a housing crisis. We can do better. The miserable kind of millimetre by millimetre measures that this Minister is taking is simply not good enough. It's not helping enough people in a timely enough fashion. We have to do better. And Part 3, with its promise of a minister having to prepare a plan for 10,000 houses each year, is just the start of the comprehensive package and endless supply of constructive and positive ideas that the Labor Party has. That's why we did support the Special Housing Area Amendment that we've just voted on, and we will support any constructive measures that will get more houses built and more New Zealanders into their own home.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair.